Tragic news for a small town that's been holding on to the hope of finding a missing girl alive. 9-year-old Rowan Ford went missing from her home in Stella a week ago. This morning, investigators discovered her body 10 miles south of there in Powell, Missouri. That's in McDonald County.
It was morning when investigators moved through the trees near a place locals knew as Fox Cave. Despite the name, it was not really a cave in the way most people imagine one. It was more like a sinkhole, a dark opening in the earth, hidden just far enough from the road that someone could pass by without ever knowing it was there. Deputy Mike Hall and Jake Boss made their way through the brush and reached the opening. After 6 days of searching, they found Rowan Ford. She was 9 years old. For 6 days, her mother had waited for answers. For 6 days, teachers had walked past an empty desk and tried to keep going for the other children in the room. For 6 days, volunteers had searched fields, roadsides, and wooded areas, calling Rowan's name and hoping she would somehow hear them. And during those same 6 days, the man responsible for what happened to her remained close to the search. He spoke to people. He offered help. He acted as if he was part of the effort to bring her home. That is one of the most disturbing parts of this case. Rowan Ford was not taken by a stranger passing through town. There was no unknown predator who appeared out of nowhere and vanished into the night. The danger came from someone she knew, someone who had been inside her home, someone who had sat at the family table, someone who had been around her long enough to become familiar, trusted, and safe in her eyes. She called him Uncle Chris. His name was Christopher Collings. But before this story became a criminal case, before it became a headline, before it became a trial, Rowan Ford was a real child with a real life. And that is where her story has to begin. Rowan Damia Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. By 2007, she was living in Stella, Missouri, a tiny town in the southwest part of the state, tucked into the Ozarks, with a population of fewer than 200 people. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's cars, the kind of place where a child riding a bike or walking to church should have felt safe. Rowan was in 4th grade at Triway Elementary School. She loved Hannah Montana, spaghetti, drawing, reading, and books about cats. Her favorite color was purple. She had a bicycle she was proud of, the kind of thing that can feel like freedom when you are 9 years old and the world still seems wide open. But the people who remembered Rowan did not remember her only for the things she liked. They remembered her warmth. Teachers described her as kind, hardworking, and full of light. She could be shy at first, but once she felt comfortable, she opened up in a way people never forgot. She was the kind of child who wanted to do well, who tried even when something was difficult, who kept going instead of giving up. One teacher remembered that school mattered to Rowan. She showed up ready to work. She wanted to get ahead. She wanted to do better. Math did not always come easily to her, but she kept trying. That detail matters, because Rowan was not just a name in a case file. She was a little girl still becoming herself, still learning, still hoping. Still young enough to run into her mother's arms, but already old enough to care about doing well, helping others, and being seen as someone who tried. She also loved church. Sometimes Rowan went before anyone else arrived. She would sit outside and wait for the pastor, ready to help set things up. No one had to make her do that. She did it because she wanted to be useful. A 9-year-old girl, sitting on church steps in a small Missouri town, waiting for a chance to help. That was Rowan. But behind that sweetness, there were signs that her life at home was not always easy. Teachers noticed things. Some mornings, Rowan came to school without what she needed for cold weather. Sometimes her hair looked tangled or unwashed. The adults around her saw enough to understand that she needed care, and when they could, they gave it quietly, gently, without making her feel embarrassed. On the last school day of her life, one teacher noticed that Rowan's hair was badly tangled. So before class, she took the time to help her. She brushed through Rowan's hair carefully and put it into a ponytail. In the moment, it may have seemed like a small act, one adult helping one child before the school day began. But later, that moment became almost impossible to forget, because it was one of the last acts of care Rowan received. Later that day, the teacher saw Rowan in the hallway. Rowan was skipping. She looked happy. That image, a little girl moving through a school hallway, ponytail fixed, smiling, seeming as if everything was fine, would become one of the last memories anyone at that school had of her alive. At home, Rowan lived with her mother, Colleen, and her stepfather, David Spears. Colleen worked overnight shifts at Walmart. She was trying to keep the household going, trying to provide, trying to hold together a life that was not always simple. Rowan was the youngest of 5 children. Her older sister later described her as shy at first, but special once she opened up, the kind of child whose presence could brighten a room. Rowan loved her mother deeply. When Colleen came home from work, Rowan would run to her. Not walk, not simply look up, run. As if those hours apart had been too long, and the best part of the day was hearing her mother come through the door. That is the picture of Rowan that should stay in mind before the case turns dark. A 4th-grade girl in a tiny Missouri town. A child who loved purple, books, church, and her mother. A child who tried hard in school. A child who trusted the adults around her. And one of those adults was Christopher Collings. Collings was a longtime friend of David Spears. He had been around the family. For a period of time, he had lived in the home. He was not a stranger to Rowan. He was familiar. He was part of the world she knew. He helped her with homework. He spent time in the same house. He became someone she recognized, someone she was comfortable enough with to call Uncle Chris. By late October 2007, Collings had moved out and was living in a trailer on his family's property near Wheaton, Missouri, not far from Stella. The address changed. The trust did not. And on the night of November 2nd, 2007, that trust was used against her. It was a Friday night. Colleen left for her overnight shift at Walmart around 8:30 p.m. As far as she knew, Rowan was safe at home. David was there. Nothing about the night suggested that by morning, her entire life would be torn apart. David Spears, Christopher Collings, and another man, Nathan Mahurin, had been drinking together. What began as a night of alcohol and hanging out eventually moved from David's house to Collings' trailer near Wheaton. At some point, Rowan was left alone at the house. That detail would later stand out with painful clarity. A 9-year-old girl, asleep in her home, while the adults who should have protected her made choices that placed her in danger. Later that night, after more drinking, the men separated. Nathan Mahurin drove David back toward Stella. Because he had been drinking, he avoided the main highway and took back roads instead. Collings took the faster route. According to the case record, he used that window of time to return to David's house before the others arrived. He knew the house. He knew where Rowan slept, and he took her. For a while, no one in Stella knew what had happened. No alarm went off. No neighbor understood that a child had just been taken from the place where she should have been safest. By the time the truth began to surface, the night had already moved toward something irreversible. What happened after Rowan was taken would become the center of one of Missouri's most painful criminal cases. Collings later gave statements to investigators. The courts would hear evidence. The family would be forced to sit through facts no family should ever have to hear. But the simplest truth is this: Rowan Ford was abducted by someone she knew. She was harmed by someone she trusted. And she did not come home. Afterward, Collings tried to hide what had happened. Evidence was destroyed. Rowan's body was moved. And the place where she was left was remote enough that investigators would not find it by chance. Then the search began. At first, people hoped Rowan had wandered away, gone to a friend's house, or somehow gotten lost. In a small community, hope can spread quickly because the alternative is too painful to accept. Volunteers came out, Officers searched. The FBI became involved. Roadsides, fields, wooded areas, and rural properties were checked. People called her name into the open air, believing that if she was somewhere close, maybe she would hear them. Her mother waited. Her teachers worried. Her classmates sat in a room where her absence became louder every day, and Christopher Collings remained close enough to watch the search unfold. For 6 days, Stella, Missouri, lived inside uncertainty. Then, on November 9th, investigators reached Fox Cave, and the uncertainty ended. What replaced it was grief. Because Rowan Ford, the little girl who had skipped through the hallway on her last day of school, the child who waited on church steps because she wanted to help, the fourth grader whose teacher could still remember exactly where her desk had been, was gone. The next morning, Christopher Collings did something that would later make the case feel even more unsettling. He joined the search for Rowan Ford. Saturday, November 3rd, 2007. Colleen Munson came home from her overnight shift at Walmart around 9 a.m. She was exhausted, expecting the familiar sound of her daughter's footsteps. On most mornings, Rowan would run to her when she came through the door. But that morning, there was no sound, no footsteps, no Rowan. Colleen searched the house. She checked the rooms. She looked everywhere a mother would look first, and then everywhere a mother looks when fear starts taking over. David Spears was asleep on the couch. When Colleen woke him and asked where Rowan was, he said she had gone to a friend's house. But the answer did not make sense. Which friend? When had she left? Who had picked her up? Why had no one told Colleen? Colleen started calling people, friends, families, homes Rowan might have visited. Anyone who might know where her daughter was. Every answer was the same. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. Colleen wanted to call the police. David told her not to. He said Rowan would come back. He made it seem as if Colleen was panicking too soon. So for a while, she waited. That delay would later become one of the first things investigators could not ignore. A child was missing from her own home, and the first response from one of the adults closest to her was not urgency. It was hesitation. By evening, Colleen could not wait anymore. At about 6:50 p.m., she called 911. And from that moment, Stella, Missouri, changed. At first, people still hoped there was a simple explanation. Maybe Rowan had gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe she was with someone who had not yet been reached. Maybe this was a misunderstanding that would end with a frightened little girl coming home. But hour by hour, that hope became harder to hold. An Amber Alert was issued. Local officers responded. Volunteers came out into the cold November air. In a town with fewer than 200 people, a missing child is not just a police matter. It becomes everyone's nightmare. People searched roadsides, fields, wooded areas, and rural properties. They called Rowan's name into the dark. By November 5th, the FBI was involved. Multiple agencies were working together, trying to find one 9-year-old girl. But the search was not bringing answers. No Rowan. No clear witness. No easy explanation. And almost immediately, investigators began looking closely at David Spears. There were reasons for that. He had been one of the adults responsible for Rowan before she disappeared. He had not called police when Colleen first realized Rowan was gone. His first explanation, that Rowan was at a friend's house, did not match what Colleen found when she started calling around. Then his story began to shift. Investigators learned there were parts of the night David had not fully explained at first. His statements changed. His timeline raised questions. And the more investigators listened, the more suspicious he seemed. For a time, David Spears became the person law enforcement focused on most. Then there was Christopher Collings, the family friend, the man who had once lived in the home, the man Rowan knew as Uncle Chris. From the outside, Collings seemed helpful. He spoke to investigators. He appeared worried. He offered assistance. He stayed close to the search and acted like someone who wanted answers. But sometimes, guilt does not look like silence. Sometimes it looks like cooperation. Sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it looks like a person trying very hard to stand exactly where an innocent person would stand. Collings did more than simply answer questions. He tried to point attention toward David. He suggested David might know more than he was saying. He placed himself in the role of the concerned friend who wanted to help investigators find the truth. And for a while, that performance worked. But not on everyone. Wheaton Police Chief Clinton Clark had known Christopher Collings for years. He knew his normal behavior. He knew how he spoke. He knew how he carried himself. And during the search for Rowan, something about Collings felt wrong. Clark noticed that he seemed tense, uneasy, different. Not like a man simply worried about a missing child, but like a man carrying something he could not fully hide. That mattered, because in some investigations, the first crack is not a piece of evidence. It is not a confession. It is not a witness suddenly appearing with the whole truth. Sometimes the first crack is one person saying, "Something is not right." Clark contacted investigators and told them what he had noticed. From that point on, Clark became important to the case. Investigators believed that if Collings was going to talk, he might not do it in a formal interview room. He might not open up to strangers, but he might talk to Clark. Someone he knew, someone he trusted. So Clark kept speaking with him. He listened. He watched. He gave Collings room to keep talking. Over the next few days, the pressure around Collings grew. On November 7th, he continued to appear cooperative. He gave a DNA sample. He signed consent forms. He allowed investigators to search areas connected to him. His behavior changed. He became emotional. He became defensive. He said that if investigators were going to accuse him, he did not want to keep talking. Later, he went back to Clark. He was shaken. He talked about not wanting to answer more questions. He mentioned that he might need a lawyer. Clark reminded him of his rights, and Collings signed a waiver. For a moment, it seemed as if Collings was close to saying more. But the moment passed. The conversation was interrupted, and Collings left. Clark immediately contacted investigators. He understood that Collings was near a breaking point. The truth felt close, but it was not out yet. The next day, November 8th, investigators were still searching for Rowan. Another man, Mark Bridges, became part of a key moment in the investigation. Bridges knew both David Spears and Christopher Collings through work connections, and he spent time with David while law enforcement monitored the situation. At one point, Bridges asked David to think like Christopher. If Christopher had taken Rowan, where would he go? Where would he hide the truth? David led him toward a rural location in McDonald County, a place known as Fox Cave. It was isolated, easy to miss, hidden enough that someone could pass nearby without knowing it was there. Law enforcement was contacted. The next morning, November 9th, deputies went to Fox Cave. And after 6 days of searching, Rowan was found. The search was over, but the investigation was not. From that moment, everything changed. This was no longer only a missing child case. It became a homicide investigation, and every question became heavier. Who had taken Rowan? Who had lied? Who had helped? Who had known more than they admitted? Clinton Clark was in his car when the news came through that Rowan had been found. Soon after, he learned that Christopher Collings had already been looking for him that morning. Collings had asked when Clark would be on duty. He said he needed to speak with him. He said it was urgent. Investigators gave Clark a simple instruction. Find Collings. Tell him Rowan had been found. Watch what happens. But Collings was not easy to locate. Clark drove through Wheaton looking for him. Then Collings called. The first thing Collings asked was not about Rowan. He asked if police were following him. He said he thought he was being watched. He sounded nervous. He sounded afraid. And in that moment, the performance began to fall apart. This no longer sounded like a concerned family friend. It sounded like a man who knew the investigation was closing in. Clark told him to come to the station. Collings did not want to talk there. He wanted to meet somewhere else, somewhere quieter. Eventually, Collings got into Clark's patrol car. He was not under arrest. He was not restrained. Not yet. As they drove, Clark told him what investigators had asked him to say. Rowan had been found. For a moment, Collings lowered his head. The truth was moving closer. At the station, there were too many people around. Collings said he could not talk there. He wanted to go somewhere quiet. They drove to a place outside Wheaton, near Muni Bridge. Clark notified other officers where they were going. When they arrived, Collings stepped out of the car. Then he turned toward Clark and held out his wrists. Clark told him that was not necessary. Collings answered quietly, "It will be." They sat down near the bridge, and then Christopher Collings began to talk. At first, Christopher Collings repeated the same story he had been telling investigators all week. The drinking, the pool table, the trailer, Nathan Mahurin driving David Spears home by the back roads. For a while, nothing changed. Then Collings kept talking. He said that when Nathan chose the longer route, he understood there was a window of time. A small one, but enough. According to what he told Chief Clinton Clark, Collings took the faster road back toward Stella. He reached David's house before the others did. He went inside the home he already knew well, and then he took Rowan. That was the moment the case changed forever. Not because investigators had suspected no one, not because there had been no theories, but because the man sitting there with Clark was no longer speaking like a concerned family friend. He was no longer performing worry. He was no longer pointing toward someone else. He was admitting that he had been involved. Collings told Clark that after taking Rowan from the house, he brought her back toward his property near Wheaton. He admitted that Rowan was harmed there. He admitted that she never returned home. He admitted that after her death, he moved her to the remote area where investigators would later find her. He also described attempts to destroy or hide evidence. For Chief Clark, the confession was devastating. This was not a nameless suspect. This was someone he had known for years. Someone whose family he knew. Someone who had trusted him enough to call him when his own life had fallen apart. And now that same man was sitting near Muni Bridge, telling him what had happened to Rowan Ford. Clark would later testify about that moment, and even years later, it was clear that the memory had not left him untouched. Collings told enough for Clark to understand that the investigation had reached the truth, or at least a major part of it. Then Clark told him that he would have to repeat what he had said, not only to Clark, to other officers, to investigators, to people who would record it, test it, compare it, and eventually bring it into court. Collings agreed. They drove back. At the station, with officers and federal agents present, Collings gave another statement. Later, he gave a recorded statement as well. The core of his account remained consistent. He admitted taking Rowan, admitted causing her death, and admitted trying to cover up what had happened afterward. For investigators, the confession was a turning point. But it did not make the case simple. Because when David Spears was brought back in, the story became more complicated. David had already been suspicious to investigators for several reasons. He had delayed calling police. His early explanations had not made sense. His timeline had shifted. He had borrowed his mother's vehicle during the night and had not provided a clear explanation that satisfied investigators. Now, after learning that Collings had confessed, David gave his own statement. And in that statement, David placed himself much closer to the crime than he had before. He said that when he returned home that night and found Rowan missing, he believed Collings had taken her. He said he borrowed his mother's car and went to Collings' property. He then gave investigators an account that suggested he had also been involved. That created a major problem. Now investigators had two men making statements. But those statements did not fit together cleanly. Collings admitted his own role, but he repeatedly denied that David Spears had been involved in Rowan's death or in the disposal of her body. Every time investigators pressed him on David's possible involvement, Collings denied it. David, on the other hand, had made statements that implicated himself, so the case became tangled in contradiction. There were reasons investigators could not simply ignore David. There were questions about his behavior on the night Rowan disappeared. There were questions about the car he borrowed from his mother. Cadaver dogs reportedly alerted on that vehicle, which raised serious concerns for investigators. There were also troubling materials found during the investigation that added to their suspicion of David. But suspicion is not the same as proof, and that distinction would become central. Because prosecutors could not take two completely conflicting stories into court and pretend both were fully true at the same time. If the state argued that Collings alone was responsible, then David's later statement created questions. If the state argued that David was directly involved, then Collings' repeated denials created different questions. And if prosecutors pushed both versions too far, they risked damaging the strongest case they had, the case against Christopher Collings, whose confession was supported by evidence connected to his property, his vehicle, and his own statements. That was the painful legal reality. For Rowan's family, none of that made the outcome feel easier. Colleen had lost her daughter, and now she had to watch the justice system move through evidence, contradictions, legal thresholds, plea negotiations, and decisions that may have made sense on paper, but still felt impossible to accept emotionally. David Spears had been the adult in the home when Rowan disappeared. He had told Colleen to wait. He had delayed the call to police. He had lied or changed parts of his story. And yet the state ultimately did not move forward with a murder conviction against him. The murder charge was dropped. David Spears pleaded guilty to lesser charges connected to child endangerment and hindering the investigation. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. With credit for time served after his 2007 arrest, he was released in 2015. Christopher Collings, meanwhile, became the central defendant in the murder case. He would later be tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and, after years of appeals, executed by the state of Missouri on December 3, 2024. But even after all of that, the case never felt completely clean. One man was executed. One man served a shorter sentence and eventually returned to life outside prison. And Rowan Ford's family was left with the kind of question no court process can fully heal. How could so many adults fail one little girl so completely? Because at the center of every confession, every contradiction, every legal decision, and every appeal was still Rowan. Not the case file, not the headline, not the courtroom argument. Rowan. A 9-year-old girl from Stella, Missouri, who should have been protected by the people closest to her. In March of 2012, nearly 5 years after Rowan Ford disappeared from her home in Stella, Missouri, Christopher Collings finally stood trial. The trial took place in Phelps County. The jury was brought in from another county, away from the small communities where Rowan's name had never really left the air. By then, the case was no longer only about what happened in November of 2007. It was about accountability. It was about the people who had loved Rowan being asked to sit in a courtroom and hear the legal version of the worst days of their lives. The defense tried to explain Christopher Collings through the lens of his past. They spoke about childhood trauma, instability, emotional damage, and mental health concerns. They argued that his life had been shaped by neglect and disorder long before Rowan ever knew his name. The jury heard that. Then they heard about Rowan. They heard from the people who remembered the child at the center of the case. Not as evidence, not as a headline, as a person. Colleen, Rowan's mother, spoke about what life became after her daughter was gone. She had once been the mother who worked overnight shifts and came home to a little girl running toward her. Now, she was a mother trying to survive a silence that never really ended. Rowan's older sister spoke about the way grief changed the entire family. She described the kind of pain that does not stay in one room or one year. It spreads through birthdays, holidays, school memories, and every ordinary moment that should have included the person who is missing. People from Rowan's school and church community also remembered her. They remembered a quiet girl who could brighten a room, a child who tried hard in class, a child who loved church, a child who rode bikes, read books, skipped through hallways, and wanted to help. One of the most powerful voices was Todd Holt, her fourth-grade teacher. He had been one of the adults who saw Rowan not as a case, but as a student with a desk, a place in the classroom, and a future that should have kept unfolding. That is the part that makes cases like this so hard to carry. The courtroom can talk about charges. It can talk about evidence. It can talk about aggravating factors, motions, appeals, and sentencing. But none of those words can fully hold the life of a 9-year-old girl. The jury did not take long. Christopher Collings was found guilty of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, the jury decided that the crime met the legal standard for the death penalty. The court entered that sentence, and from there began years of appeals. The case moved through the courts: Missouri Supreme Court, Federal Court, the Eighth Circuit, the United States Supreme Court. One by one, the appeals failed. Collings' attorneys continued to argue that his background, mental health, and brain-related issues should be considered. They asked for clemency. They argued that his sentence should be changed to life in prison. But Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied clemency. And on December 3, 2024, the sentence was carried out at the state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Rowan Ford would have been 26 years old. That date mattered. Not because it erased anything. Not because it healed anyone. And not because a legal ending can ever replace a human life. But because for Rowan's family, for the people who searched for her, for the teachers who remembered her desk, and for the investigators who carried the case for 17 years, it marked the end of one chapter. Christopher Collings would never hurt anyone again. But justice in this case has never felt simple. Because David Spears lived a very different outcome. He had been Rowan's stepfather. He had been in the home that night. He had delayed the call to police. He had changed parts of his story. Investigators had questions about his actions that never fully disappeared. But suspicion is not the same as proof. The state ultimately dropped the murder charge against him. He pleaded guilty to lesser charges connected to endangering Rowan and hindering the investigation. He served his sentence and was released years before Collings' execution date ever arrived. That fact still leaves people unsettled. One man was sentenced to death. Another man walked free after a much shorter sentence. And between those two outcomes sits the question that has followed this case from the beginning. Did the full truth ever come out? Maybe Christopher Collings acted alone. Maybe there were things David Spears knew that were never fully proven in court. Maybe the legal system reached the only outcome the evidence could support. But for Rowan's family, none of that changes what was lost. Because Rowan Ford was not a legal argument. She was not a theory. She was not a point of debate between two versions of a confession. She was a little girl. She was 9 years old. She loved purple. She loved books about cats. She loved church. She rode her bicycle. She skipped down school hallways. She ran to the door when her mother came home from work. She had teachers who noticed when she needed care and gave it to her gently. She had classmates who remembered her. She had a best friend who missed her. She had a desk that no one wanted to clear. And she had a life that should have been so much longer than 9 years. After Rowan's death, the people who loved her found ways to keep her name present. At Triway Elementary, students and teachers honored her memory. Her favorite color, purple, became part of the way people remembered her. A tree was planted. Notes were written. A small memorial stood as a reminder that Rowan had been there, that she had mattered, that she had been loved. Years passed. Memorials changed. Some were damaged, some disappeared. But Rowan's name did not. In April of 2025, on what would have been her 27th birthday, Triway Elementary dedicated a permanent memory bench in her honor. That matters. Because a bench is not only stone. It is a place to sit, a place to pause, a place where future students, teachers, and families can see her name and ask who she was. And someone can tell them, Rowan was a student here. Rowan was loved here. Rowan was safe here. Rowan mattered here. For the teachers who knew her, the bench was not just a memorial. It was a promise that no matter how many years pass, Rowan Ford will not simply become an old case in an archive. She will remain a child people remember, a child whose name is spoken, a child whose story still asks something of everyone who hears it. Because this case is not only about one man's guilt, it is also about warning signs, about trust, about the adults who failed to protect her, about a small town that searched for her, about teachers who cared enough to remember the exact place where she sat, about a mother who came home from work expecting to hear her daughter's footsteps and instead found silence, and about a little girl who deserved so much more than the world gave her. There is no perfect ending to a story like this. There is a verdict. There is a sentence. There is an execution record. There are court documents and news articles and dates that can be placed in order. But there is no ending that gives Rowan back the birthdays she never reached. No ending that gives her family the years they lost. No ending that turns grief into peace overnight. The only thing that can still be done is to remember her honestly. Not for the worst thing that happened to her, but for who she was before it happened. Her name was Rowan Damia Ford. She was born on April 11th, 1998. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, a friend, a little girl from Stella, Missouri, who loved purple, loved church, loved books, and deserved to grow up. And if this story stays with you, let it stay for the right reason. Not because of the darkness, but because Rowan's life mattered. If you believe stories like Rowan's should be told with care, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime cases told with respect, facts, and humanity. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from. But more than anything, remember her name, Rowan Ford. She was here. She was loved. And she will not be forgotten.